response to this kind of problem? What solution could we have in place? We could add more people, because this would surely mean that things will be going faster. If we're not having enough output, that means not enough hands are at work. And this is just common sense. Common sense is a phrase that pops up pretty frequently when we use System 1 thinking. So this is an intuition that might be useful for several different applications in life, but organizational design and complex processes like creating software are not those contexts. A System 2 approach to this would be systems modeling, looking at past experiences and figuring out where the actual bottlenecks are, also having a deeper understanding of what the implications of hiring more people and simply adding them to a late project might be. So, very different outcomes. And it seems that if we want to have a successful organizational change, less adoption, we need to get System 1 out of the way for as much as possible and engage System 2 as much as possible. And this is where the studies of the emotional impact on decision making bring something interesting to the table. So there is quite a bit of studies on the subject already, and it is an ever-growing body of knowledge. The 2014 meta-analysis on this, so a collection of output of several different research papers, has a few key observations to make. And one of those is that emotions are not necessarily a form of heuristic System 1 thought. Emotions are initially elicited rapidly and can trigger swift action consistent with System 1, but once activated, some emotions, example sadness, can trigger systematic System 2 thought. So it seems that this is the key to distinguish between the situations where these emotions can be helpful or can be very detrimental to a less adoption. And it's pretty much a matter of getting over this initial defense from new data response. Once we can do that, we can leverage the discomfort that we feel, the pain and the sadness that we feel from having these prolonged and serious problems, to actually put full force behind trying to come up with a solution that will make those not so frequent in the future. And this, as it turns out, is extremely tricky. So there is no one good recipe to do that, and I don't think anybody actually expected that going into this talk, but if they did, sorry. I struggled with the idea for a while and figured out that the best thing that I could do with this kind of perspective is try and look back at the less adoptions and organizational changes that I've been involved in the past and try to figure out from the perspective of people's emotions, of people's pain, what were the key factors that held the change back or that made the change a bit easier. So this is a bit different from the very default standard type of working about this from an engineering perspective. I have a software engineering background, so I like to think about less in terms of the impacts of the organizational design on the amount of asynchronous dependencies between teams, and then the impact of the asynchronous dependencies on cycle time, which in turn impacts the adaptability of the system to where the value actually is, which is still a valid way of thinking about less. But for the purpose of this talk, I would like this to take a back seat, and I would like to focus firstly on the things that the people in the organizational organization perceive as painful, and treat these hard facts as kind of background or input to this. And a similar disclaimer as with Bas's talk, because this is quite a sensitive area, and the people might not be very comfortable with this being published. Please refrain from recording or publishing these materials in the future. So I would like to talk about a few organizations, and the first organization I worked with in this capacity was a big organization. And the thing about the big organization is that it was very big. It had several thousand people working on a single product, and the product was safety critical to several people using it either directly or indirectly. So obviously, one of the very many concerns that the organization had was code quality. From the external perspective, the product needed to have a very good track record and availability. So it was extremely important to both the business side and the people actually working with the development. On top of that, the people had a very strong engineering culture of being good at what they do. So there was a lot of personal stakes attached to being a very good specialist. And System 1 thinking kicking in made this become a traditional Conway's Law abiding organization. So Conway's Law states that there is a huge similarity between the organization structures and the products structure for organizations that create products. So if you have an organization chart and the architecture chart of your product and they look very much alike, this is a Conway's Law abiding organization. And it leads to silos being created within the system, where rather than thinking about the product and the product being available, the product being fault-free and well integrated, people start thinking about what to do to make the problem not be visible or not occur in our part of the product. Still, it is a unconscious assumption here that if we narrow down the field of expertise and the field of interest of all the people working on the product, that will mean that everybody will have their own special part of the product that they know very, very well. They can focus on this, they can become world-class experts, and everybody will be all the better for it. However, this leads to predictable integration problems because, as it often is in such organizations, people go very, very quickly in the direction of whatever suits the local needs of a component, but the integration of this and the breakdown of the requirements into something understandable for all the component organizations needs to happen elsewhere. So this produces both integration problems and cycle time issues. So this causes a lot of pain for the engineers who want to be able to work on a stable, reliable system, but have to constantly go back and fix problems with stuff that was implemented a year ago by them, and they don't remember what the actual context of that was, or worse yet, several years behind by someone else completely who had already left the organization. But because the organization is so big, so complex, and the integration is being done elsewhere, these things occur with increasing frequency. On top of that, the problems with the integration and the cycle time start to have business ramifications. The product head and the business people start to notice that the adaptiveness of the product is not at a level where it is comfortable in the market, and competition starts creeping in. So something needs to be done to alleviate this pain from both the business side and growingly from the technical side. Luckily, the product head is someone who's had experience with less prior, who's had experience with significant transformational change, and is quite prepared to do the steps necessary to rectify these problems. So what can we do in a context like this? So the first step that the organization took was focusing on the technical practices of the teams. And this has a twofold game, because on one hand, it starts off not by attacking the stuff that the teams feel very strongly about, their sense of belonging or their sense of identity as ex-developers, experts in a certain programming language or on a certain part of the system, but rather than that, it focuses on the stuff that everybody agrees is very useful. It talks about the automation and the test coverage, it talks about test-driven development and acceptance test-driven development. So every single component in the system, without touching the organization at first, can feel some benefit from the change that is slowly being introduced. This has an interesting side effect of the barriers between traditionally separated developer and tester roles dissolving, because this kind of strict division, which is incompatible with less, but this is not yet important at this stage, makes it significantly more difficult to keep a good level of test automation and a good cycle time, or completely incompatible with the test-driven development mode of work. So because these roles are still located within the same part of the organizational structure, this doesn't require much of a change in the power structure and is considered relatively safe, but already signals that this direction is potentially promising and brings a benefit to the thing that a lot of the people in the organization care about most. However, with this step, you hit a ceiling on the improvement at a certain point, because just improving the integration practices of specific components and silos within the organization can only get you so far in terms of integrating the entire product, in terms of having it tested, in terms of looking at the end-to-end cycle time of the entire thing. So next steps need to be considered. Luckily, because the test automation is at a pretty good level already on the component level, this means that crossing these boundaries is not so scary anymore. Again, consider the fact that this is a safety-critical product for a lot of people and potentially lives might be at stake. So the emotional difference of going into the part of the system that you are not an expert in, between a situation of no tests versus a good safety net of automatic regression, is huge. So the actual focusing on the technical practices before we get to this point allows us to alleviate the fears that a lot of people would have with making the next step otherwise. So once we're in that position and we see that the cycle time improvements have hit a limit, we can go for a certified less practitioner or less training for a cross-section of the organization. And we don't want this to be a management training only, because that will create some problems with GOSI and be internally contradictory. So what is done is a training for a cross-section of the organization comprising of high management, middle management, and direct superiors of the teams, the team members themselves, some subject matter experts, product managers, some project managers who are still present at the company, the team output owners, labeled as product owners but actually having only component level authority. We gather a cross-section of these people in a single workshop, and we talk about the state of the system, the bottlenecks that we have, the problems that the organization currently faces, and what kind of problems the large-scale Scrum framework is meant to solve. So when we compare these two, it turns out that it is a good match, and at this point, after some groundwork already having been prepared, we make a decision to go for a less adoption, using some teams that were on the forefront of the technical improvements and feel about this very strongly. So we do have volunteers, we do have some good faith by the successes that we've already had with the groundwork, and now we are going for a less adoption. Again, this being a product with thousands of people working on this, this is definitely a huge variant of the less framework, even on the less huge side. So usually the prescription to adopting this would be to have a parallel less-based organization next to the traditional organization and gradually move teams over to the new organization. This is a place where we decided to sort of diverge from the guide, and we went for a partial parallel organization, meaning the teams stayed in their previous organization structures while the product management aspect of things, the single product owner and the area product owners were placed in the product management organization as prescribed by the model pretty much. The reason for this was the amount of pain that management felt from the traditional organization was so big that it would be a bad idea to completely let go of the potentially best teams that they had, those being the pioneers, the volunteers, the people who spearheaded the technical improvements, while still maintaining the same amount of pressure from the project management aspect of things, who are meant to be completely cut off from the less adoption. So being faced with a dilemma between going for a full parallel organization, which the management would likely oppose very, very strongly because that would mean more pain for them, or going for a compromise which still gave us some field to improve, we decided to go with the latter. And it turned out to be a good decision. It was a scary adoption, and there was a huge amount of friction at first, mostly from the single component specialists who now learned that there will be these barbaric hordes from the other parts of the organization coming into their code and making changes without having worked there for a year. However, this kind of pain became alleviated quite easily by just having the people talk in the same room about a functionality. So when the people saw that the engineers that they were dealing with only wanted to do that to deliver some sort of customer functionality, did enough groundwork to actually prepare to know the context of the work in their software component, and had the knowledge to probably work there in a way that would not deteriorate the quality. This got out of the way after a few meetings between the team members directly, which were not very frequent in the old way of doing things. Eventually, the teams managed to get the expected value throughput and the desired outcomes of the less adoption were achieved. So after a few months, there was a questionnaire for the teams that took part in the adoption, asking them how they felt about the quality of their work, the satisfaction that they have, and the overall feeling about this being the proper direction to go in. And the majority was very much in favor of that. So the majority of people felt that they are learning a lot of new things that are very useful to deliver better value for the customer, that the quality of their work in their respective components, because of the amount of interlearning, has improved, and they felt extremely empowered, autonomous, and driven to actually take a very active stance in product development for the future. So things were looking up very, very much, and this was a context in which we could expect the next teams being added to the parallel less organization to be quite enthusiastic about this as well. This isn't what happened, however, because the organization head, who had been providing very serious top-down support for this change for a very long time, decided to leave the organization. So despite having a large body of evidence showing that this move made it easier to deliver a lot of value in shorter time with greater employee satisfaction and a benefit, or at least a perceived benefit in quality from the people who actually worked on these parts of the system, usually, this was discarded because the new vision from the top down was quite different, and this vision had to do with decomposing the work earlier, decomposing the work from the top down, and having more of a command and control approach. So even though we had empirical data to back this up, without this crucial top-down support, the amount of positive reinforcement that the change got was not enough to sustain the change. And the entire set of these organizational changes got reverted. The positive thing about this, though, was leveraging the enthusiasm of the people that we had along the way. So, starting off with the technical practices and the things that people feel the most pain about, made them open to more drastic changes and going even further in the same direction, to the point where we had a very well-working sub-organisation. And given the fact that the people are still there, the same observations will remain the next time these problems re-emerge. So this is a good takeaway from a story of a less adoption that unfortunately got cancelled midway. The next organisation I would like to talk about is a medium organisation. The medium organisation has a very different product. The product is not safety critical. It is an organisation of about 200 people, and about 100 people are working actively on the development of the product. And there is a very established sense of community in the medium organisation. This is a homegrown agile adoption that without any accent on particular frameworks was achieved to mostly improve the cycle time, decrease the pain of having to deal with huge chunks of functionality in the release, and how release with huge sets of features put a strain on all of the teams. So even though the teams were again organized according to the assumption that we need to specialize narrowly, there was a component-based organization of teams with a team-level so-called product owner. There was a very established sense of community, because that was something that the teams achieved together, and they still felt that there is a lot of freedom to move around, to support other people should your expertise be needed, to learn new things, and to work for a common goal, even though there were so many backlogs. Cooperating with business, however, was a relatively new concept to the organization, because in the early days of this homegrown adoption, where it was completely bottom-up, the idea gained a lot of traction and a lot of interest with the development side of things, because the pains of infrequent releases and of bulky testing procedures were theirs to solve. So they had a very huge stake to improve things, but business was not that excited about this entire agile thing. So they just passed on this, forcing the development teams to fill in the blanks and creating kind of a role of a fake product owner on their end, only multiplied by the number of components and having to coordinate between each other, because the organization decided not to go for a single product owner. And this divide between the development side of things and the business side of things created some internal friction, because the product was expected to go in one way and ended up going in another. This caused more and more pressure to close the gap, and this manifested in a very familiar way of time pressure. So there was an increasing pressure from the business side to deliver the functionalities that were missing to make up for the difference in the vision of the product. And this became a standard contract game pretty much, with this kind of pain being new to the teams, resulting in weakening the definition of done, growing manual regression, increasing strain and stress, particularly on the people who felt responsible for the quality of the product, and it was kind of a downward spiral. In this organization, there was a quite different approach to the problem top-down. So to the people in charge of the organizational structure, it looked like the problem is not enough coordination and not enough synchronization. So despite some efforts from bottom up to alleviate that, and having seen how this ends up, a top-down mandated work splits was assumed. And this gave the people around the top of the organization a sense of more safety. It gave them a sense of more control into the product, even though it meant that the coordination of the entire thing became a bit more difficult. This also meant that the plans were imposed on the teams because this was no longer their decision to make. This caused them some pain because it was a significantly lesser degree of autonomy than they were used to. A single prioritized list was created on top of the existing individual team backlogs, and this was a very interesting phenomenon to watch, because what's from a less perspective would be a very natural candidate for a product backlog. If we have the business perspective in one place, then we should simply work our way from the most valuable items down through the less valuable and so on and so forth. But this was used as a tool in a traditional contract game with the business, basically to show them that whenever they request any kind of change, that needs to be inserted here, and that means that everything else moves below. However, this was still not used as a basis for coordination or planning of the work itself. This was still on the backlogs. On the individual team backlogs maintained by the individual so-called product owners. So, because of this, there was a growing sense of overcomplication and strain on these coordination structures. Because if you think about this, it turns out that their job is kind of impossible, and trying to solve this with the system one response of we don't have enough output, or we're not following the plan close enough, we need to apply more pressure, adds them a significant amount of stress. However, expecting this to be coordinated centrally, plus in an environment that the priorities can actually change as we plan them, is not very sustainable. So some product owners working with more than one team actually decided to simplify the coordination bottom up. And where they would have 3 teams that they work with 3 backlogs, they would now have 3 teams with 1 backlog. This was still not a single backlog setup, but it was significantly less than previously. This led to more inter-team coordination and shared understanding of the product vision, and an improvement in the capability of the teams to support each other should one of them feel too much pressure from the business side. This caused an increased transparency of problems. So the good thing about having this single prioritized list, even if this is not the single source of truth in terms of the work that we do, is we now have a very painful source of truth that pokes us in the eyes, saying items from 1 to 5 throughout the past 3 months have not been done. However, items from 20 to 30 are okay and have been delivered on schedule. So this is something that is very painful to the teams and the people working on this, because they have this vision of the product laid in front of them fairly clear, and they are not allowed to work in a way that allows them to realize it best. So this creates even more friction, and as the organization rejects the idea of working from the single product backlog, there is even more pressure put on the top-down coordination organization. There are even more synchronization meetings between the product owners or product managers. There is more pressure put on the architecture team to identify dependencies early and to make sure that the team's work is harmonious. But none of this seems to bring any good effect. So after a certain point, without seeing any improvement in the output of the system, but seeing more and more pressure being put on a lot of the people, several people in the organization start to leave. So the pain points in this example are twofold. On one hand, we have an organization that initially started off kind of splintered and with good intention, starting with a component basis, with everybody having their own part of the job to do, thinking that this would help. A lot of people seeing the evidence of how having a shared vision and this kind of setup figured that this would be a good idea to go one step further and dissolve these structures and just think about how we could work from a single list of priorities and support each other in getting the most important things out the door first. However, this did not outweigh the System 1 reaction of fearing of losing control and not being able to, for the CTO to jump in and just jamble up the items between the teams as they see fit. Failure to get across this System 1 response, unfortunately, led to several people in the organization losing patience and moving on to other things. Lastly, the example of the small organization. The small organization is a very different beast again. This is about 20 people in development working in a company of about 50 people. They are organized in 3 teams, and their culture of self-management is extremely strong because the product organization head is someone who believes in being as hands-off in most of the decisions as possible. So whatever the teams decide to organize around, whatever the teams decide to work like, anything goes pretty much. And in this environment, people again have the same assumption that if we have people who are specialists in a single technology, in a single part of or multiple parts of the system, but these are their parts of the system and nobody else touches this, this is good for quality. Again, a common sense System 1 response that leads to a lot of over-specialization, and it's easy to gloss over the fact that this causes a lot of additional effort for integration and coordination. So this becomes a microservice flavored component-centric organization with a strong division between development and testing. This results in a work redundancy that is visible both from the business perspective, because whenever a requirement comes into the system, sometimes several teams need to do very similar jobs in different parts of the system because they are their part of the system, and also on the end of the actual teams, because working on one product and analyzing a error just to even notice which part of the system is coming from tends to be quite difficult when all the teams have their own different logging solutions, stats collecting solutions, etc. So the work redundancy becomes quite painful both for the people that have to do it because it's just a sense of meaningless work, and for the business people because they feel like the organization isn't outputting as much value as it could under different circumstances. Further, it is becoming increasingly confusing to work with incoming items because the people in the business are not expected and should not be expected to know how a certain requirement maps to a certain part of the system architecture. Rather than that, they just know that they have a need that needs to be solved with product development. But with this kind of setup, it is difficult to tell which team I should come to get my work done. So there is a growing amount of frustration from the stakeholders within the company because pushing things through the system becomes just so much more difficult, and they can feel like their voice is being drowned out by the technology people who know exactly where to go. And this causes quite standard issues with cycle time, because having several queues and several people working on different parts of the system, while having the central point of business value being kind of secondary to that, causes a significant difference in the time that people will be working on a certain feature. Sometimes in a 3-person organization, this can even take a year. So the case there is quite extreme and calls for quite some changes. So in this situation, it turns out that the siloing hurt testing the most. So one of the first things that we could do there was support the teams in the automation of their regression. What ended up happening is, because of the assumption that we need narrow specialists looking at certain parts of the system and everybody just does their part of the job, that left a lot of developers leaving end-to-end system testing behind as something that is not natural to a component-based organization. What ended up happening was the testers that were left with this had very little support in development skills needed to automate this. And there was, again, a growing number of manual, repetitive tasks that was just soul-sucking and very error-prone work if you need to click through the same set of things every 2 weeks or so. So supporting them in automating things that were previously thought impossible to be automated and caused a lot of repetitive work day to day was a very good way to insert into the conversation the idea of the compatibility of a component team setup with automated end-to-end testing. If someone needs to take up end-to-end testing, why should it be the team that did this part of the system rather than that part of the system, if both are being impacted by the same feature? So on one hand, it took the immediate pain and the parts of the system development that were the most painful for a lot of the people away, and it also opened up the discussion in a way that isn't attacking the teams for making the decisions that they made in the past, but rather than that, trying to support them in eliminating the biggest pain points that they have. This opened up a very good reason to set up some communities of practice. One of the first ones was the inter-team testing community of practice, which focused primarily on automating the regression and inter-team decisions on how automation should be made. An architecture community of practice followed suit quite quickly, and it turns out that a lot of the friction that had been present between the teams and a lot of the conflict resulting from people specializing in very different aspects of the technology could be solved simply by them making joint decisions at a certain point in time on how certain features will be delivered, even if not all of them are working on those features. So again, just giving the people the space to talk about these things and having a good example of a successful community of practice where the testers are free to support each other in eliminating their pain, even though the organization still chooses to have a distinction between testers and developers. This is a good situation to open with. So eventually we notice that we have certain bottlenecks in the product development that we could alleviate by spreading the knowledge of some of the tech stack. So what we did was we also enabled travelers to a traveler-like solution where people would leave their team for a sprint or two and join a team where their expertise was in deficit. So we could have a Java expert joining a team which is primarily PHP focused, so that they can get their first service off the ground, so that they get familiar with the tooling, etc., etc. This increased the trust between the teams extremely, and it made it quite visible to the people that the reason that we have certain differences in approach isn't ill will or just people ignoring quality or the larger vision of the product, but just a different set of circumstances that, with the proper support, we could jointly get over. After a certain while, it turned out that with this increased trust and increased amount of interworking between the teams, it no longer made sense to have 3 sessions of planning and 3 sessions of sprint review between the teams, because a lot of the topics were either repeated between those, or it was just creating additional place to have a mismatch. Because on one sprint review we can say that the next thing that we should take care of as an organization is X, but another team a week later on their sprint review can say that we should now take care of Y. Combining this would alleviate this risk, and it would allow people to support each other in delivering the most prioritized items better, which was a top-down decision based on the amount of inter-team cooperation that we enabled through setting up the communities of practice and the travelers. So the outcomes of that were a sense of significant quality increase around the board between the teams specifically that had no prior experience with the technology, or where the frictions were on the boundaries of this team's components versus this team's components. This increased cooperation improved that significantly. It also made the decision-making a lot easier, and it lessened the impact, or it lessened the likelihood of there being dead decisions made. So previously, it was very painful for the people that when they would meet at the beginning of work on a certain functionality, some decisions were made, and then when each team went in their own individual direction, it turns out that the decisions were either forgotten or not followed half a year ago. This eroded trust significantly, but once the communities were set up and the ceremonies were more combined, this changed significantly and made the decisions a lot easier to follow through. This in turn caused an increase in satisfaction and better relationships within the work, and opened up the doorways for further improvements between the teams. There was also some shared code ownership introduced, seeing as it doesn't really make sense to assign the end-to-end tests in an organization to one component. Still, the teams decided to keep a significant amount of their code ownership, but this is a good foot in the door kind of tactic to show them that not all shared components necessarily need to be catastrophical in terms of quality. Actually, people have an easier time learning from each other when the boundaries are taken off, and this is a good starting point for future spreading of such practices. So, in the small organization, it turns out that the siloing that had been a result of historically thinking that we are best suited to maintain a high code quality if we specialize very heavily, this lack of trust was the main pain point and the main thing that stopped the organizational progress. So latching on to the point that was a shared problem for a lot of the teams in terms of end-to-end testing, opened up that door. It enabled a lot more inter-team trust, and once that was achieved, given the top-down culture of self-management, it was quite easy to follow up with more organizational change, moving towards one product backlog, and potentially in the future end-to-end feature teams if the organization deems it useful. But it is no longer that kind of scary topic that completely shuts off thinking and puts you in full System 1 defensive mode. So the common factors that I would have from these three very different companies in terms of working with pain and working with emotion in organizational change is that large-scale Scrum is inherently scary. For the vast majority of organizations that we will work with, this idea of letting go of roles, of breaking down silos, of everybody, of extreme decentralizing of coordination is so far away from the current reality of people. It is so far away from the paradigm that they've invested years in developing in, that it will likely elicit a System 1 response the first time they hear about it. So the first time people hear about eliminating the architecture team as a separate team and dissolving it into the feature teams, that there should be only one product owner and one product backlog, and that the team should be end-to-end. This is an almost guaranteed negative emotional response, which is quite useless to combat with arguments. So you have to have a way of dealing with that to move any further. A quite universal pain point between very different organizations seems to have to do with testing. And this is because of how the system dynamics kind of converge on testing, where it is kind of possible to ignore the cycle time issues and the spikes in the pressure from the development perspective or the specification perspective, because maybe in the next month we will get lucky and the important features will be in the X component and not in our component. Testers don't have that, because huge pressure for work comes in big spikes, where it turns out that 3 important functionalities have been added and you need to test this quickly. You don't get support in terms of automating that, so it's a lot of very boring and high-stress work. So looking for a way to support the testing to improve the coverage, to improve the cycle time, to deduplicate the tests that are already there. It seems to be a very good way in, because this is where a lot of the pain converges for a lot of the organizations. It is also a seemingly important observation from these three examples that the product head involvement and that the product head stance can make or break a change. So even if we have an organization pretty much unanimously wanting to shift away from a command and control structure, a top-down split structure, a product head that is resisting this with these other kind of assumptions is not a barrier that most organizations, if any organization ever, will plow through. So getting the product head involved can actually make a less adoption either viable or inviable. And to top this off, it seems impossible to avoid the fact that the work of a Scrum Master or an Agile coach, which there is a lot of here, seems to have a lot to do with dealing with people's pain. And when you look at the organizational change from that perspective, that is a quite scary thought, because that means that you are going to the organization and you are picking the worst parts of it day in, day out in your work. And this is the most effective way to actually help people. And this can be quite risky from a mental health perspective, because you kind of gather all the pain from the different parts of the organizations, and you have to empathize with the people to be able to get through that initial System 1 response and eventually to be able to help them. And sometimes it all falls apart still. So this is one of the reasons, or the way I interpret it, is that the guides for the Scrum Masters in the LESS books always have the staying sane recommendations section, because it just requires some additional effort not to let the pain of the entire organization get to you too much. A good way of doing that, I found, was noticing the impact on the individuals, because while the impact on the organization may vary, it is a significantly complex structure in terms of any kind of organizational change. And every now and then you will get to the point where you've done all that you can and you will still fail. However, if you look back through the journey of working through these problems with people, you will notice that there are many individuals who you will need to have talked to and will need to have convinced about a different way of looking at things. And this is a change that is actually lasting. So keeping that in mind, it is always a lot more easy to notice the impact and the value in your work, even if it all ends up crashing and burning. Which is also the reason why you should remember that sometimes if you can't change the company, you should change the company. And on that optimistic note, this is all I have in the topic. Do we have some time? We do have time for some questions, if there are any. Yes?
I would like... Can you hear me without the mic?
Good.
No, it's coming.
Thanks for the learning. I wanted to ask about your personal experience. How many transformations have you done? How big they were? Just rough, short summary.
So that depends on what boundaries you would ascribe to a transformation, because two of the examples that I gave were explicit transformations where the organization explicitly said, okay, maybe all three were explicit transformations, where two of them were less-ish transformations and one of them was absolutely not. And you can probably guess which one is which. And I've spent about 7 years in one of them and over a year in the medium and small organisations.
Thank you.
I have a question regarding testing, because you mentioned several times, and I have.
Can you speak up, please?
Yeah, sure. I have a question related with testing, automated
Mm-hmm.
testing. You talk about test-driven development, and I heard about it in other talks here. My experience is that this introducing test-driven development is something really hard. There is a lot of